Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a story that, well, it begins with a really terrifying, dramatic collapse. Imagine a country's entire central government just dissolving pretty much overnight, plunging the nation into civil war, famine, chaos. Chaos so profound it triggered a major international intervention, and that included the infamous Black Hawk Down incident back in '93. That's the scene in Somalia starting in 1991.
It really was a period of utter fragmentation. The state, for all intents and purposes, just ceased to exist. It was replaced by competing clan-based militias, warlords controlling different patches of territory.
And our mission today, as we dig into this stack of sources you've pulled together for us, reports, analyses, historical accounts detailing Somalia's journey, is to understand the incredibly complex, really challenging path Somalia has been on ever since. We want to pull out the crucial nuggets, the important facts, the key insights, and try to get a clear picture pretty quickly.
Right. And specifically, we'll be looking at, I think, three main forces that have really shaped Somalia. There's the profound struggle for genuine sovereignty, the persistent and deadly al-Shabaab insurgency, and then the deeply complex, sometimes contradictory role of foreign actors.
Exactly. This isn't just, looking back at history books. It's about the real-world implications of trying to build a state basically from scratch, while dealing with conflict, and how all that international involvement, however well-intentioned maybe, actually impacts things on the ground. It's a vital topic. I'm ready to dive in.
Great. Where should we start?
So let's start right at the beginning. Take us back to that moment in '91 after Siad Barre's regime fell. What was the immediate aftermath like? How did the country even cope with no central authority?
Well, the immediate fallout was just brutal civil war, driven by rival clan militias fighting for power and resources. It spiraled very quickly into a devastating famine by late 1992. Estimates suggest around 300,000 Somalis died. It was that catastrophe that prompted the initial U.S.-UN intervention.
The one that ended with Black Hawk Down.
Exactly. That incident in Mogadishu in October '93 led to the withdrawal of most international forces, leaving a power vacuum again.
So the intervention leaves, but the lack of a central government, that just continues.
Absolutely. For almost a decade, from '91 until around 2000, there was no functional national government at all. The country fractured. It split into these clan-controlled fiefdoms. And it's during this time that the Northwest declared itself the independent Republic of Somaliland, and the Northeast established the autonomous Puntland state. They sort of went their own way.
Okay, so nearly 10 years with basically no state. What about the first actual attempts to bring back some kind of national government?
There were several efforts, mostly backed by the international community. You had the Arctic Conference in Djibouti in 2000, which created the Transitional National Government, the TNG. It got international recognition. But domestically, it struggled. A lot of warlords, a lot of regions just didn't accept its authority.
And then there was another attempt a few years later.
Yes, the 2004 Nairobi Conference led to the Transitional Federal Government, the TFG.
And these early attempts, the sources seem to suggest they were maybe less about what Somalis needed and more about, quote, external designs.
That's a really key point the sources make, yeah. These processes were heavily shaped, sometimes even driven, by outside powers, regional countries, the UN, Western donors. The TFG, for instance, couldn't even base itself inside Somalia initially. It was set up in Kenya, mainly due to insecurity, and was heavily reliant on support from Ethiopia and others.
Okay, so here's where things take a really interesting and ultimately critical turn. One that really sets the stage for everything that follows. The rise of the Islamic Courts Union.
Yes, the ICU. They emerged around 2006. And it's important to note, they weren't initially seen as purely extremist. They gained a lot of popular support because they provided security. They brought some basic order to areas that had been plagued by warlord violence for years. They actually managed to take control of Mogadishu for a brief period in mid-2006.
And that quick success prompted a big reaction from one neighbor in particular.
It did. Ethiopia was very concerned about having a group perceived as Islamist consolidating power right on its border. So in late 2006, they intervened militarily. They had support from the U.S. for this, and they quickly ousted the ICU and installed the TFG, that transitional government, in Mogadishu.
That sounds like it must have completely changed the dynamic.
Oh, it was a massive turning point. That foreign military intervention is widely seen as the direct trigger for the fierce al-Shabaab insurgency we still see today. Al-Shabaab was essentially the militant youth wing of the ICU. They very effectively capitalized on nationalist feelings against the Ethiopian intervention.
So the intervention aimed at stabilizing things actually unleashed something much worse.
In many ways, yes, Somalia quickly became one of the deadliest conflict zones in Africa, and crucially, that intervention severely damaged the TFGI's legitimacy. For many Somalis, it was seen as a government brought to power, basically by foreign tanks.
So the TFG is in Mogadishu, but it's weak, propped up.
Exactly. The period from, say, 2008 to 2012 was incredibly challenging. Al-Shabaab grew stronger, controlling large swaths of south-central Somalia by 2010. The African Union mission, AMISOM, which started deploying in 2007, became absolutely essential. They were literally the security backbone protecting the government in a small part of Mogadishu.
But eventually things shifted slightly.
Al-Shabaab did withdraw from Mogadishu city proper in 2011 under pressure. And then finally, in August 2012, the whole transitional period officially ended. Somalia adopted a provisional constitution, and they inaugurated the federal government of Somalia, the FGS.
Right, the start of the Third Republic, technically the first permanent central government since '91.
Correct. And Hassan Sheikh Mohamud was elected president by the new parliament.
But the years since 2012, they haven't exactly been smooth sailing either.
Far from it, no. The FGS has really struggled to extend its authority much beyond the capital. You have powerful federal member states who are often reluctant to cede power to Mogadishu. They held indirect elections again in 2016-2017, which brought Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo to power. His term was marked by really intense political clashes with those states, major election delays.
And that led to a serious crisis in 2021.
A very serious constitutional crisis, yeah.
Yeah.
It even led to armed confrontations right there in Mogadishu between different security factions. It was extremely tense.
Wow. And how was that resolved?
Eventually, through another indirect election in 2022, Hassan Sheikh Mohamud was actually reelected, and importantly, there was a peaceful transfer of power, which was frankly a relief given the tensions. But the whole episode just highlighted how fragile the political process still is. And if you look at this whole history, connecting it right up to today, what's really striking is how this entire road, this attempt at recovery, has been, as the sources print it, fitful and externally guided. The UN, the AU, neighboring countries, Western donors, they haven't just been giving aid. They've been heavily involved in mediating peace deals, influencing power-sharing formulas, shaping the actual frameworks of the Somali state.
Which brings us right to a central, really difficult question about the FGS today. Can we actually call it a sovereign state? I mean, truly sovereign.
That's really the crux of the debate you see in these sources. On paper, yes. The FGS is internationally recognized. It has a flag, ministries, institutions. But the reality on the ground, according to many observers and these reports we're looking at, it really makes you question its de facto sovereignty. Does it operate less like a genuine state and more like, well, like a construct that's just overwhelmingly reliant on external support?
Some critics you mentioned go as far as calling it a donor-dependent NGO state. That's a pretty sharp term.
It is sharp, yeah. And the basis for that criticism, well, the financial dependence is probably the starkest piece of evidence. One specific detail from the sources really jumps out. In 2023, roughly 73% of the entire FGS budget was funded by donor grants.
73%. Wow. So less than a third of their operating budget actually comes from within Somalia.
Exactly. Domestic revenue collection is minimal. And that donor money, it's largely earmarked for specific things like security sector salaries, administrative costs. It's a government running primarily on foreign cash. And it goes even deeper. The sources estimate that Somalia's total security spending, salaries, equipment, operations, comes to around $1.5 billion a year. And they state this is, quote, effectively paid by international partners.
Wait, so even the salaries for their own soldiers, even elite units like the U.S.-trained Danab commandos, that's mostly paid by outsiders?
To a very large extent, yes. Through ATMIS stipends, bilateral donors, U.S. stipends for Danab, it's incredible dependence. And it's not just the money. The sources describe how even basic national planning, like development plans or policy frameworks, they're often drafted with heavy input from sometimes even drafted by external consultants, often to meet specific donor benchmarks like, say, IMF requirements needed for debt relief.
Okay, so extreme financial dependence. What about political influence? Is there oversight from outside?
There's definitely an element of what the sources call international guardianship. You have the UN Special Political Mission, UNSO, right there in Mogadishu, advising on reforms, mediating political disputes constantly. And Western donors, plus institutions like the IMF and World Bank, they set crucial benchmarks, conditions tied directly to aid money and debt relief. Somali leaders feel enormous pressure to meet these conditions just to keep the financial lifeline going.
And the sources give a really clear example of how that pressure translates into direct political leverage, don't they?
They do. The 2021 election delay is a perfect case study. When the political deadlock threatened to completely derail the process, key donor institutions actually froze budgetary support. That created an immediate fiscal crisis for the government. It basically forced the political actors back to the table to find a way forward towards elections.
So aid wasn't just support, it was a political tool.
Absolutely. It's a stark illustration of direct foreign leverage, and it raises that fundamental question. Are FGS leaders ultimately making decisions to satisfy their own citizens or to satisfy their international partners who hold the purse strings?
Okay, so financial dependence, direct political pressure. What about the most basic function of a state, controlling its own territory, providing security for its people?
This is another fundamental challenge to the idea of FGS sovereignty. Huge parts of Somalia are still outside government control, either held by al-Shabaab or controlled by local clan militias. Even in Mogadishu, the government relies heavily on the AU peacekeepers, ATMIS now, just to guard key buildings and infrastructure. And for any complex operations, they rely on foreign-trained special forces.
So the regular Somali National Army, they aren't really up to the task.
The regular SNA units often suffer from, well, inconsistent pay, lack of equipment, logistical problems. And critically, they're sometimes perceived as being more aligned with specific clans than with the national interest. Holding territory cleared from al-Shabaab often requires continuous external backing or relying on local clan militias. It's not self-sustaining state capacity in many areas.
The sources use the phrase on life support.
That's the assessment, yeah.
Yeah.
A government kept afloat by donor funding and foreign military protection. And this whole situation, this deep dependence, it raises a really big question about accountability, doesn't it?
Right. If your money and your security rely so much on outsiders, who are you really accountable to?
It sounds a bit like that classic rentier state model, but instead of oil revenues coming from the ground, the rent is foreign aid flowing from donors.
And citizens must feel that disconnect.
That's what the sources suggest. People on the ground sometimes feel their government is more focused on donor priorities, things like counterterrorism cooperation, or meeting IMF fiscal targets, than on their urgent needs for basic services, justice, or just reliable security. Often, essential services like healthcare or education are actually delivered by international NGOs or UN agencies, not the state, which means the state loses a key way to build legitimacy and connection with its people.
That must be incredibly frustrating, disempowering for ordinary Somalis.
It really sounds like it. The sources quote one Somali observer saying, "We feel like we have no soul because of this constant dependence." And critics argue this dynamic can actually empower corrupt elites who are happy to play along with foreign agendas like counterterrorism as long as the aid keeps flowing to them without necessarily delivering for their population. It creates this situation where the FGS can sometimes act more like a big NGO, focused on donor reports and external perceptions rather than, governing authentically.
And this reliance on the outside seems to push Somali leaders towards spending a lot of time and energy on international diplomacy travel.
That's a very noticeable pattern the sources discuss, yes. Somali presidents, ministers, they're known for extensive international travel, engaging in global forums. And the question gets asked, is this focus on building global relationships and securing aid coming at the expense of addressing urgent problems back home?
There was specific criticism about President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed's travel schedule just recently, wasn't there?
Yes, in 2024, opposition figures quite openly criticized what they called his excessive travel. They argued it diverted critical attention, resources, leadership focus away from crises like insecurity, the ongoing drought impact, pervasive corruption. They questioned if the trips really delivered enough value to justify the cost and the absence.
And the government's defense of the travel.
Oh.
It can kind of reinforces the whole dependency point, right?
It absolutely does. Their argument is that this travel is essential for maintaining key alliances and, crucially, for securing that vital foreign aid and support, which just underscores their own view that these external relationships are fundamental to the government's survival. And that, in turn, dictates their priorities. But the optics, like President Hassan Sheikh apparently spending over 190 days abroad during his previous term, that feeds a public perception that leaders are more focused on international appearances than fixing domestic issues.
And the consequences of that outward focus become brutally clear when humanitarian crises strike.
That's where the disconnect can be really stark, yeah. You have leaders attending donor conferences talking about reforms, while back home, populations might be facing desperate situations. The 2022-2023 drought, for example, was the worst in 40 years. It pushed millions towards famine conditions, and domestic critics accused the government of reacting too slowly, being too focused elsewhere.
And there were reports they were even reluctant to officially declare a famine. Why would they do that?
According to the sources, yeah, there was a reluctance. The apparent fear was that declaring a famine would generate negative publicity, maybe scare off potential investors, and undermine the narrative of progress they try to project internationally.
So prioritizing PR over acknowledging the scale of the suffering.
That's the criticism. Somali commentators pointed out that while, yes, climate change is a factor, just blaming that lets the government and maybe the international community off the hook for the chronic governance failures, the lack of infrastructure, the insecurity, the corruption that leave people so incredibly vulnerable when the rains fail.
Okay, so when you put all that together, the financial dependence, the external political leverage, the limited control over territory, this outward focus of the leadership, what does it really mean for Somalia's sovereignty?
It means that sovereignty, while officially recognized on paper, is structurally compromised. It's undermined by this deep ingrained reliance on foreign funds, foreign security, and foreign approval. This dependence warps the incentives for the political elite. It pushes them towards prioritizing securing external backing, often over building genuine legitimacy and accountability with their own population. And the result tends to be this outward-facing government where internal governance, service delivery, addressing public needs, they often take a back seat, which, ironically, might just entrench the very weaknesses that make Somalia dependent in the first place. It's a tough cycle.
That paints a really challenging picture of the state itself. Now let's shift focus to the core security threat that's defined so much of the last 15-plus years. Al-Shabaab. Despite enormous international and domestic efforts, they just persist. Why? What are the roots of their resilience?
Al-Shabaab's endurance is really multifaceted. It draws on internal Somali factors, but also, as the sources reveal, some pretty surprising, maybe indirect external dimensions as well. Remember, they emerged directly from the ICU after that 2006 Ethiopian intervention. They very skillfully exploited nationalist anger against the foreign military presence, and they stepped into the governance vacuum left by the weak transitional governments.
And they offered something, didn't they? Something the government often couldn't provide.
Exactly. In the areas they control, they provide a harsh, brutal form of Sharia law, yes, but they also administer a form of justice, they collect taxes, they offer a degree of predictability and order. For communities that had suffered for years under abusive warlords or just faced total government absence or corruption, Al-Shabaab's predictable, albeit ruthless, system sometimes held a grim appeal.
So it wasn't just about ideology, it was about practicalities too.
Very much so. They also exploit existing clan grievances, sometimes aligning with marginalized groups to gain local support, or at least, passive acceptance. What's really crucial to understand is that al-Shabaab's longevity is fundamentally a symptom of Somalia's weak, fragmented state structures. It's not just some alien force. Many communities tolerate them or even work with them out of sheer necessity because the government simply isn't present or effective enough. They're deeply interwoven with parts of Somali society through a mix of fear, ideology, and sometimes pragmatic local arrangements.
So it's not a purely military problem that you can just, bomb out of existence.
Far from it. Military operations can clear territory, sure, but the persistent failure has been the inability of Somali state forces, even with international help, to effectively hold that territory, govern it, and provide better alternatives. They often can't consolidate gains without continuous external support, which allows Shabaab to just melt away and then return later when the focus shifts.
How do they keep funding themselves? Insurgencies need cash.
They are remarkably adept at generating revenue, mostly illicitly. Their primary income comes from extortion and what they frame as taxation on businesses and civilians. This happens not just in areas they fully control, but even in areas nominally under government control, or just along transport routes. Everyone from livestock traders and farmers to major import-export businesses in Mogadishu have reported paying protection fees to al-Shabaab to operate.
So they're deeply plugged into the local economy, extracting wealth.
Yes, very much so. They've also profited enormously from smuggling operations, particularly the illegal charcoal trade, despite a long-standing UN ban. They export huge amounts of charcoal, mainly to markets in the Persian Gulf, earning millions and millions of dollars. This involves a whole network of complicit traders, transporters, and buyers, including some foreign actors knowingly violating sanctions.
And this smuggling, It leads to one of the most, frankly, shocking and disturbing details mentioned in the sources, doesn't it?
It does. The notorious conflict profiteering example. This involved the illicit sugar and charcoal smuggling network operating in southern Somalia near the Kenyan border. A detailed investigation back in 2015 revealed that elements within the Kenyan military contingent, the KCF, part of the Amisom peacekeeping force, were deeply complicit in this trade.
Wait a minute. You're saying members of a foreign army sent there specifically to fight al-Shabaab were actually in business with them, smuggling with them?
That is precisely what the source, a UN monitoring report, laid out. These KDF elements were reportedly involved in smuggling cheap sugar out of the port of Kismayo into Kenya and facilitating the export of illegal charcoal out of Somalia, allegedly in partnership with al-Shabaab militants who controlled the production areas.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
How much money are we talking about here? This wasn't small scale.
No, not at all. The estimated value of this particular illicit trade network was staggering. The report put it somewhere between $200 and $400 million per year.
Per year. And who got the money?
According to the report, the profits were effectively split three ways. Among al-Shabaab itself, certain KDF officers involved in facilitating the trade, and elements within the local Jubaland administration in Kismayo.
So some of the very people tasked with defeating al-Shabaab had a direct, massive financial incentive for the conflict, or at least the instability that allowed this trade to continue, because they were personally profiting to the tune of hundreds of millions.
That's the devastating implication, yes. This kind of high-level corruption and complicity directly fueled al-Shabaab by providing them with enormous revenue streams, and it created powerful spoilers both within the international intervention force and locally, who had a vested interest in maintaining the profitable status quo of conflict and weak governance. It just fundamentally complicates the whole narrative.
Okay, putting that absolutely incredible example aside for a moment, what about the persistent allegations that foreign states directly back al-Shabaab? Is there evidence for that?
This is a really politically charged question, and there's a history of accusations. For years, especially in the late 2000s, Eritrea was widely accused of arming and financing al-Shabaab. The UN Security Council even imposed sanctions on Eritrea in 2009, partly based on those claims. However, and this is a really crucial clarification from the sources, the UN's own monitoring group, year after year throughout the 2010s, stated they found no conclusive evidence of ongoing state-level Eritrean support for al-Shabaab. Those specific sanctions on Eritrea related to Somalia were eventually lifted in 2018.
So that specific, widely reported claim of state sponsorship, it didn't ultimately hold up under detailed UN investigation over time.
That's what the UN investigators concluded repeatedly. Now, al-Shabaab is linked to al-Qaeda. They pledged allegiance back in 2012, and they do receive ideological guidance, some training expertise, and probably some limited funding from the broader global al-Qaeda network. They have foreign fighters too, but the key point is, no foreign government is known to openly sponsor al-Shabaab today. They are officially an enemy of every state in the region.
So it's more about those illicit trade networks, maybe informal money flows, and their connection to transnational jihadi groups.
Exactly. There are reports, often hard to verify, of individual informal donations coming from sympathizers, perhaps, in the Gulf states. But these are typically private networks, not state policy. And while you hear speculation, sometimes bordering on conspiracy theories, that rival Gulf states might somehow indirectly use Shabaab as a pawn against each other, the sources are clear that hard evidence for this is very scarce.
What about the conflict next door in Yemen? Does that spill over?
There's definitely a connection, mainly through the rampant weapons smuggling across the Gulf of Aden. The war in Yemen has made that much worse. UN investigators have found evidence that arms intended for various factions in Yemen, potentially including weapons linked to Iran or the Houthis, have ended up in Somalia. They're likely sold on the black market there, and some Iranian origin weapons have been traced to al-Shabaab stockpiles. But again, this seems to be more about opportunistic arms trafficking, taking advantage of regional chaos, rather than a deliberate state policy by Yemen or Iran to arm al-Shabaab directly. So if we step back, besides the militants themselves and those profiting from illicit trade like that KDF example, who else might benefit, maybe indirectly, from al-Shabaab's persistence?
Well, the KDF example certainly points to individuals or groups profiting from the whole war economy setup.
Absolutely. But maybe more broadly, al-Shabaab's continued existence is what guarantees Somalia remains a top priority for significant foreign security assistance. Billions of dollars over the years. This creates what some call a donor gravy train. It directly benefits certain Somali politicians, military leaders, contractors, who are positioned to receive and manage that aid. And there are recurring accusations, difficult to prove definitively but persistent, that some might inflate troop numbers or slow walk reforms precisely to keep that security funding flowing.
And regionally. You mentioned earlier that some neighbors might perhaps cynically prefer a weaker Somalia.
Yes, that sentiment that Ethiopia and Kenya benefit from Somalia's weakness is something you hear from Somali observers. While both countries are crucial partners in the fight against al-Shabaab, a strong, stable, unified Somalia could theoretically revive old territorial claims on Somali-inhabited regions within those countries or emerge as an economic competitor. So actions like Kenya's strong backing for Jubaland's autonomy or Ethiopia's long history of cultivating influence with specific Somali factions, some interpret these actions as not just being about counter-Shabaab, but also about keeping the central government in Mogadishu somewhat contained or dependent. And of course, international security contractors, logistics firms, they also profit from the ongoing instability and the international response. So the key takeaway on Shabaab's resilience is that while military pressure is part of the equation, their endurance is primarily a symptom of Somalia's deep-seated governance failures, corruption, clan grievances, and poverty. Defeating them requires much more than just military tactics. It means tackling these root causes and disrupting the networks, both illicit and political, that allow them to sustain themselves.
That cycle makes a grim kind of sense. The insecurity justifies external involvement, but that involvement can sometimes inadvertently hinder the very governance improvements needed to truly end the insecurity. Which brings us neatly to our final major theme: the deep, pervasive influence of foreign actors, not just in security, but right in the heart of Somali politics.
Absolutely. Foreign powers are incredibly deeply embedded in Somali political life. They influence everything from who becomes president to which policies get prioritized, even how elections are run. And it's a complex mix of players now. You have the traditional UN and Western donors, the immediate regional neighbors, and increasingly powerful players like the Gulf Arab states and Turkey, often with competing agendas.
Let's start with the UN and Western donors. They seem to see themselves as the sort of guardians or architects of this whole state-building project.
That's definitely the role they've played. As described in the sources, they've been central mediators in nearly every major peace conference. They helped draft the provisional constitution, and they continue to mediate political disputes constantly. And crucially, their financial aid gives them enormous leverage to push for specific reforms in political processes.
And they push really hard for democratic reforms, like moving towards direct one-person, one-vote elections, right?
They did, very strongly. For years, achieving universal suffrage was presented as a key benchmark for legitimacy and continued support. They helped draft electoral laws, set timelines. But the reality on the ground, the pervasive insecurity, the huge logistical challenges, and frankly, the political resistance from powerful clan and regional elites invested in the current system meant that Somalia ultimately had to stick with the indirect clan-based election model in 2016 and again in 2021-22.
So the donors pushed for these Western democratic ideals, but in the end, they had to basically endorse the old clan-based system.
Exactly, and that's one of the central ironies highlighted in the sources. After years of pushing for one person, one vote, they ultimately had to accept and, in effect, endorse the 4.5 clan power-sharing formula as the only pragmatic way to select a parliament and president.
Could you just quickly remind us what that 4.5 formula actually is?
Sure. It's essentially a system for distributing political power, like seats in parliament, based on clan identity. It gives equal shares, or one, to each of the 4 major Somali clan families, and then lumps all the smaller minority clans together into a 0.5 share. It emerged as a Somali compromise during earlier peace talks, but by repeatedly endorsing it as the basis for elections, critics argue that international actors have effectively entrenched clan-based politics as the formal operating system of the state, rather than helping Somalia move beyond it towards a system based on individual citizenship.
And these indirect clan-based elections, the sources say they're extremely vulnerable to corruption.
Yes, that's a major criticism. They're described as being rife with corruption. The last electoral process in particular was characterized by reports of widespread vote buying, bribery, and intimidation among the clan delegates who actually select the MPs. And there are persistent, strong rumors that a lot of the huge sums of money changing hands during these elections actually originated from foreign sources trying to buy influence over the outcome.
So foreign money could be directly influencing who gets into parliament and ultimately who becomes president.
That's the strong implication, yes. And it's not just money. Western diplomats also get very directly involved in the political negotiations. The sources cite the heavy engagement by the U.S. ambassador and the EU envoy during that 2021 election crisis. They weren't just observing, they were actively mediating, meeting with all sides, even reportedly issuing threats of sanctions against individuals seen as spoilers. Now, while that might be necessary sometimes to break a deadlock, that level of direct intervention inevitably shapes who emerges as leader. And it creates this sense of dual accountability, where Somali politicians feel they have to answer not just to their constituents, but perhaps even more importantly, to their foreign backers.
Okay, so beyond the traditional Western donors in the UN, a relatively newer but hugely impactful set of players are the Gulf states.
Yes, they've become major players over the last decade or so. They bring significant financial resources, but they also bring their own regional geopolitical rivalries directly into the Somali political arena. This really intensified after the 2017 Qatar crisis, which pitted Qatar and Turkey against the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Somalia, because of its strategic location and its internal fragility, unfortunately became a key battleground for this rivalry.
And they weren't subtle about picking sides within Somali politics.
Not at all. Broadly speaking, you saw Qatar and Turkey aligning more with the central government under President Farmajo, with Qatar even reportedly helping finance his 2017 election campaign. In response, the UAE and to some extent Saudi Arabia cultivated closer relationships with some of the federal member states and opposition figures, especially after the UAE had a major falling out with Farmajo's government.
It was that extraordinary incident with the plane load of cash being seized at the airport.
Yes, that was a huge story in 2018. Somali authorities at Mogadishu airport seized $9.6 million in cash that had been flown in on a private jet from the UAE. The UAE claimed the money was intended to pay salaries for Somali troops they were training. But many Somalis, including government officials at the time, suspected it was actually intended for buying political loyalty, maybe influencing MPs or other elites. It caused a major diplomatic spat.
This rivalry between the Gulf states sounds incredibly disruptive for Somalia's internal politics.
It's been described as a dangerous new twist, absolutely, because it injects large amounts of unaccountable foreign money and intense political competition directly into Somalia's already fragmented and vulnerable system. And Somali politicians, being pragmatic, quickly learned how to play these external patrons off against each other. The sources describe them as sometimes becoming gullible conduits for campaign money, allowing elites to extract funds for personal or political gain. You had reports of presidential candidates and MPs flying directly to Abu Dhabi, Doha, Ankara before the 2022 election, explicitly seeking financial and political backing, and widespread allegations of MPs being on monthly payrolls from foreign sponsors receiving thousands of dollars.
And these Gulf rivalries didn't just fund politicians, they actually influenced Somali foreign policy and even deepened the splits between the central government and the regions.
Absolutely. Geopolitics played a role in decisions about things like who gets to manage Somalia's ports. And when President Farmajo maintained neutrality in the 2017 Qatar crisis, refusing to cut ties with Doha as the UAE and Saudi Arabia demanded, the UAE significantly ramped up its direct support to certain federal member state leaders, particularly in Puntland and Jubaland, effectively encouraging them to challenge Mogadishu's authority. And crucially, these Gulf sponsors often align themselves along existing Somali clan lines. For example, the UAE often found allies among Darad leaders in Puntland and Jubaland, while Qatar was seen as closer to Hawi leaders often dominant in Mogadishu. So these external rivalries get overlaid onto existing clan cleavages, making Somali politics even more polarized and zero-sum.
Turkey seems to have carved out a slightly different niche compared to the direct Gulf rivalry.
They have, yes. Since a very high-profile visit by then Prime Minister Erdogan back in 2011, during a terrible famine, Turkey has consistently positioned itself as a long-term partner offering brotherly support. And their contribution has been very tangible. They've invested heavily in visible infrastructure, rebuilding roads, hospitals, schools. They managed the Mogadishu port and airport. And significantly, in 2017, they opened a major military base in Mogadishu, their largest overseas base, specifically to train the Somali National Army.
So their influence comes more from being seen as an indispensable partner delivering actual benefits?
Precisely. They coordinate closely with the FGS, providing essential services and security training, which actually helps strengthen the central government, unlike some other external interventions that empower regional rivals. As a result, many Somalis tend to view Turkey quite positively. Their aid feels less overtly transactional, less tied to geopolitical games compared to the Gulf states, and more focused on visible development. However, Turkey's close alignment with Qatar did mean they sometimes implicitly favored the Mogadishu government against UAE-backed regional leaders. And there were accusations that the elite Turkish-trained Somali units, known as Gorgor, were sometimes used for internal political purposes by the incumbent government under Farmajo. So even Turkey's positive influence isn't without complexities.
Okay, so we've covered the donors, the Gulf states, Turkey. What about the immediate regional neighbors, Ethiopia and Kenya? They have such a long, complex history of involvement.
Their involvement is probably the oldest and, in some ways, the most deeply entangled. It's largely driven by their own security concerns, cross-border clan dynamics, and sometimes historical territorial interests or rivalries. Ethiopia, as the regional heavyweight, has been deeply involved since the 90s civil war, backing various factions then. They were strong backers of Abdullah Yusuf's TFG presidency in the mid-2000s, and then, of course, there was the major 2006 military intervention, which was effectively regime change.
And they've maintained a significant presence and influence ever since.
Yes, consistently, both through their large troop contributions to AMISOM, now ATMIS, and also through separate bilateral military deployments, especially along the border regions. They exert significant influence, particularly in Ethiopia bordering Somali states like Galmudug and Hirshabelle, and there are frequent reports of them interfering in regional state elections to try and install friendly leaders. Remember that 2018-2019 trilateral alliance between Farmajo, Ethiopia's Abiy Ahmed, and Eritrea's Isaias Afwerki? That raised a lot of eyebrows and concerns in Somalia, and there were strong suspicions Ethiopia supported Farmajo's controversial attempt to extend his term in 2021. Ethiopia's motivations are complex, primarily preventing instability spilling over, countering al-Shabaab, ensuring a non-hostile government in Mogadishu. But their methods, like allegedly training proxy militias or working directly with specific clan elders, were often seen by Somalis as direct infringements on their sovereignty.
And Kenya, what's their main interest and approach?
Kenya intervened militarily in southern Somalia in 2011, initially unilaterally after cross-border kidnappings by al-Shabaab, and then their forces were integrated into AMISOM. They've maintained significant influence, particularly in the Jubaland region bordering Kenya. They effectively control the strategic port city of Kismayo and strongly support the autonomy of the Jubaland state under its longtime leader, Ahmed Madobe. This is widely seen as Kenya creating a buffer zone against al-Shabaab, but also giving Nairobi leverage over Mogadishu. Then there's the unresolved maritime boundary dispute between Kenya and Somalia, which went to the International Court of Justice. That's a major source of ongoing tension, and there have been accusations that Kenya tries to manipulate Somali politics to get a favorable outcome or delay implementation of the ruling. And as we discussed with the charcoal trade, Kenyan forces, like Ethiopia's sometimes, have faced accusations of pursuing illicit economic interests in the areas they control.
And both Ethiopia and Kenya often seem to operate through specific clan channels, right? Which must complicate things further.
This is a really critical point the sources emphasize. Both neighbors have a long history of cultivating relationships and working through specific clan networks. Ethiopia, for instance, has often aligned with certain Daraud factions, while Kenya has strong ties with Ogadendarod groups who are dominant in Jubaland. This selective engagement directly inflames inter-clan suspicions within Somalia. It reinforces the perception that Somali politicians aren't acting solely in the national interest, but might be beholden to external patrons. It's very common in Somali political discourse to hear accusations that rivals are agents of Addis Ababa or Nairobi. And if you connect this whole picture of foreign influence back to the internal dynamics, it becomes really clear that clan identity and clan politics are the main prism through which much of this external influence operates. Remember the 4.5 formula, originally a Somali idea, but now essentially endorsed and institutionalized by outsiders, that provides the framework.
So instead of maybe pushing Somalia towards a modern, non-clan-based state, the way outsiders engage often ends up reinforcing clan identity as the main organizing principle of politics.
That's exactly the argument. Outsiders often find it easier to gain influence by aligning with specific clan or regional factions. Somali leaders, in turn, learn to leverage foreign allies against their internal rivals. Marginalized clans might seek foreign sponsorship to try and level the playing field. Outsiders then become amplifiers of these pre-existing internal rivalries, and this dynamic actively hinders the development of genuinely national, unified institutions like a professional army or a merit-based civil service, because those institutions themselves become arenas for the zero-sum competition between factions, often backed by competing outside patrons. There's even a point raised in the sources that foreign interference, even well-intentioned humanitarian aid, has sometimes inadvertently empowered warlordism and corruption within the clan system. A UN report noted how humanitarian aid itself sometimes became a cash cow for clan warlords and political elites. This happened because international agencies, trying to deliver aid quickly in difficult circumstances, sometimes bypassed fragile government structures and worked directly with local power brokers, inadvertently reinforcing an NGO clan-driven order.
So the very aid meant to help people could end up getting diverted and strengthening the fragmented system that keeps the state weak and vulnerable in the first place.
Precisely. It highlights how Somalia's clan-based political marketplace makes it highly susceptible to this kind of interference. Outsiders can easily find entry points by aligning with factions, and those factions can then use that external backing to resist central authority, genuine power sharing, or accountability. The outcome, as the sources suggest, is often a frail state that cannot easily stand on its own. And as the crisis group warned, in a fragile place like Somalia, competition among external actors is just as likely to harm the long-term stability as it is to help, especially when local elites become skilled at exploiting those external rivalries for their own benefit.
So if we try to sum all this up, Somalia's incredibly long and difficult journey since 1991 really seems to be a story of these profound internal challenges being compounded by a deep, almost structural dependency on foreign help. Help that is absolutely necessary for survival, yet which has also profoundly shaped and often distorted its political development along the way.
I think that captures the core tension really well, yes. The FGS is nominally sovereign, it has all the trappings of a state. But its practical reliance on foreign troops for security, foreign funds for its budget, and foreign advice for policy means it often functions more like an aid project writ large, as one source put it. It's highly vulnerable to shifting donor priorities, and its leaders can feel insulated from genuine accountability to their own public because their survival depends so much on external goodwill. That elite focus on international diplomacy over pressing domestic needs further erodes its legitimacy at home.
And the persistent al-Shabaab insurgency, it's just woven into this whole dynamic, isn't it? Its existence justifies the continued foreign involvement, but its persistence is also fueled by the war economy and the geopolitics, where various actors, maybe corrupt elements within foreign forces like the KDF example, or domestic political profiteers might actually benefit from the conflict dragging on.
Exactly. And while direct state sponsorship of al-Shabaab hasn't been proven, those indirect enabling factors, the illicit arms flows from regional conflicts, maybe informal Gulf donations, that shocking KDF smuggling scandal, they're significant parts of the picture. Ultimately, defeating Shabaab isn't just a military task. It requires addressing the underlying governance failures, the corruption, the sense of injustice that allows them to recruit and operate.
And the foreign influence in politics itself. While you could argue it was essential at certain moments to prevent total collapse or help establish institutions, it's clearly been a double-edged sword. It helped bring governments into existence, perhaps, but it's also seemed to undermine homegrown solutions, injected corruption into the political marketplace, widened clan divisions, and created leaders who sometimes seem more focused on external approval than on the well-being of their own citizens.
There's often a real disconnect between official narratives and ground realities that the sources point to. You have the FGS talking the language of sovereignty, reform, and international partnership when they're abroad, while back home, the daily reality for many Somalis is still dominated by patronage politics, pervasive insecurity, clan disputes, and chronic humanitarian need. They might celebrate achieving debt relief internationally, for instance, while simultaneously struggling to respond effectively to famine warnings within their own borders. So the path forward, as the sources seem to imply, is this incredibly delicate task. It's about finding a way to balance that absolutely indispensable foreign help with the urgent need for Somalia to assert genuine sovereignty, build domestic accountability, and start driving its own recovery agenda based on its own priorities.
Which means Somali leaders somehow need to find the political will to prioritize national interests over factional or personal gain, tackle corruption seriously, pursue genuine reconciliation between competing groups, and build the state's capacity to actually deliver services to its people, using foreign aid as a tool to achieve their vision, not just as a substitute for having one.
And on the other side, foreign actors need to exercise real restraint. They need to truly support Somali-led initiatives, resist the temptation to impose external blueprints or timelines, and crucially, refrain from picking favorites in internal power struggles, which almost always exacerbates divisions.
You mentioned a potential positive example earlier, that recent military campaign against al-Shabaab where local clan militias, the Makawasli, rose up and joined forces with the government. Is that maybe a sign of that internal agency aligning more effectively with external support?
Potentially, yes. It's an interesting example because it seemed driven primarily by local communities reaching a breaking point with al-Shabaab's harsh rule and deciding to fight back themselves. The government and its international partners then came in to support their effort. It could be a model for how internal will and external enablement might align more effectively. But the challenge, as always in Somalia, is sustaining those gains, transitioning from military clearing to effective governance, and ensuring that the support doesn't just empower new local strongmen, but actually builds legitimate state institutions. That remains to be seen.
Somalia's whole saga since 1991 is just such a powerful, maybe sobering illustration that rebuilding a state after collapse, it's not just a technical exercise, it's not just military strategy, it is a deeply, deeply political process. It's
Yeah.
all about trying to reconcile the complex, often competing interests and aspirations of Somalis themselves with the myriad agendas, some helpful, some perhaps harmful, to all these outside actors.
Absolutely. And when those internal and external interests aren't aligned, or worse, when external agendas actively override internal needs or exploit internal divisions, the result tends to be what we've seen for much of the past 3 decades. A weak state caught in this persistent, draining limbo of donor state dependency and insurgency.
Which leaves us with a final, maybe provocative thought for you, our listeners, as we finish this deep dive. What would it truly take for Somalia to finally break free from this difficult cycle of dependency and conflict? Can Somali leaders genuinely find a way to prioritize long-term national interests and the well-being of their people over the very powerful incentives and pressures that come from external patrons and internal clan rivalries? And, maybe just as importantly, can foreign actors, donors, neighbors, international organizations truly step back, trust, and support Somali-led solutions, allowing Somalia the space it needs to heal, build its own capacity, and develop durable peace and effective governance on its own terms? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Somalia's incredibly complex path since 1991. We hope this conversation gave you a clearer, perhaps more nuanced picture of the powerful forces at play, and maybe encourages you to keep exploring and thinking about these critical dynamics shaping the Horn of Africa and beyond.